What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Phoenix channel. New Year's Day coming at you with another quick one. So I thought I'd do another video here to dive into some of the things I'm learning from that new project, the EOS project I mentioned in the last video. And I talked about possibly doing a video on CPU billing and some of the discussions from one of the founders, Aiden Pierce, on that project. Shout out to Aiden if he's watching, and shout out to all the regulars who watch this channel. We got Rezi, Crypto Fees, the Crypto Type Apologist. We got Zach Gall. We got Brian Phobos and the rest of the gang. So Imagining Tech as well. So this came to my attention because I started asking some questions to Adrian Pierce. That's kind of his pseudonym, I guess, or a group of people allegedly that are creating this project that takes resources from EOS CPU to essentially create a distribution list for this new network called EOS. So users can convert their EOS to EOS tokens and be a part of this new network. Now, what was really interesting about it is not even so much the network itself, it's more so the things that we're learning along the journey here. Some of the, I wouldn't call them vulnerabilities necessarily on EOS network, but some of the things that I think we need to address. So you guys are all aware, or most of everybody's aware of the identification of the CPU modeling issues that were identified with the EOS project. Namely, the fact that when we have high CPU usage on the EOS network, we're not seeing the interest rates actually rise proportional to the demand. So a lot of people, and shout out to Sonata Systems as well. We got folks in our community who watch these videos who comment that some of these projects have EOS in particular has killed the ecosystem of EOS. But what you have to understand is that first of all, if the model was correct for renting CPU on EOS, you would have avoided the cap issues likely on the network. The issue we have right now is you have high demand and high requests for CPU on the network, but there is no real incentive for users to lend out their CPU to other users because the interest rates just don't go up high enough. And for the risk that's involved in locking up your tokens for 30 days without paying an interest, no one's going to do it. So it's not so much that EOS is even causing these issues on the network. It's more so I think people need to flip their mindset a little bit and understand that the model itself has opportunities for improvement. So that's, I think, the PC way to characterize all these things. And until we see changes to that, it doesn't matter necessarily if you have EOS or not. You could have another project just like it that does the same thing. So I think it's actually helping to identify the issue and hopefully be ones prioritizing a review of some of the options I know that have been discussed, and hopefully we'll see some fixes soon on that. But the other pressing issue here that we have, and one of them that I want to bring to everybody's attention, because there's this perception even by the likes of some of the bigger BPs on some of the channels like EOS Radio. Shout out to those guys, EOS Radio, and shout out to the family if you're watching. But I guess the one thing we need to caution ourselves with is that there seems to be this perception that with this fix, even with Dan Larimer's CPU Resources Reimagined, that it addresses most of the bulk issues with CPU rentals in terms of the interest rates paid out, and in terms of obviously having allowing the system to have access to 100% of the potential CPU resources to lend. So that was another issue with the current model, is that it relies on people actually lending their resources to this CPU rental REX exchange. And as of recently, I guess over at least a few weeks ago, we only had about 30% of the potential CPU that was in that pool, that rental pool, which means that we actually have like a third of the potential available resources only available for renting, which means that we run into congestion a lot sooner than if we had 100% of the CPU resources available to the network. So Dan's new proposal addresses the availability of the CPU. It changes it from a third, because it was a voluntary participation maybe in the Rex model, into transitioning the system to a rental model in which 100% of the CPU is available to lend out by the system. So it transitions this model from an ownership model to a rental model. And we've talked a lot about that on this channel, the past couple videos. So anybody who's interested in that, you can check it out. But there's another issue, guys, to keep in mind, and I'm sure block.one is aware of this, but I wanted to give it a little bit more visibility on the network from a community perspective, and that is the billing, the CPU billing itself. So for those OGs that have been around or know anything about like the likes of Aetherium, for example, Aetherium works on gas, obviously, to push transactions, and gas is the fee that, and I'm bringing this up, I'm bringing Aetherium up for a specific reason, to contrast that in terms of how EOS transactions work and how those transactions are paid for. So with the Aetherium model, it's an actual gas fee. So if you want your transaction to push through sooner, you would pay a higher gas fee. But then on top of that, there's also like I guess minimal, or there's like standard classes of codes, also known as operations codes. And so there's sort of a way through auditing an interaction with the contract or sending some specific transaction with a contract. You're able to audit the amount of processing that's involved in sending that transaction on a network like Aetherium. With something like EOS, you don't necessarily have opcodes. It's not classified in the same way. So in theory, the billing and the computational time isn't necessarily something that is standardized per se between BPs, I guess is the best way to describe it. And there's not necessarily a way for a user to prioritize his or her transactions on the network. So it's not like in Aetherium where you pay a higher gas fee and then your transaction goes in sooner than someone who potentially wanted to pay a lower transaction fee and paid the minimum amount of gas to the network. That transaction, in that case, the one that paid the lower amount, would probably sit in the pool or in the queue for some time before the transaction would get completed or would be processed by the nodes on the network. So EOS doesn't necessarily have that. And Aidan Pierce, one of the founders, the pseudo-founders of allegedly of this project in EIDOS, was pointing out the fact that block producers themselves can produce empty blocks. This may even be going on now. And the issue is that there's not necessarily a way to know. If a block producer produces an empty block, meaning there's no transactions in the block when their turn is called, it is still a valid block. So just because it's an empty block doesn't necessarily mean it's an invalid block. So they would still receive the inflation for producing the block, even if there's no transactions in there. And furthermore, a BP in the elected top 21 could, in theory, change his or her node EOS code, I believe it is, and change it in such a way to arbitrarily, or in some ways all the time, or it could select specific transactions. It could basically manipulate the billing, and it can manipulate the type of block that's produced. And there's not necessarily a way to directly know that without watching it, and I don't know of a tool. So if anybody's aware of a tool that does this, please bring it to our attention. But it's not my understanding there is a tool that exists like this. So it only takes 14 of the others, because you have a 15 out of 21 consensus on EOS to basically validate transactions. The 14 out of the other 14 are merely looking at what the active block producer that's producing the block is doing. So there's nothing necessarily that audits whether or not that BP has changed his or her code in Node EOS. That's my understanding. Now, if I'm wrong, I'd love to be corrected. I'm still learning about all this, but Aiden is dropping a lot of interesting questions. And so I guess where this is all going, I think, is two things. One is there is a fix now. Dan Larimer's Resources Reimagined seems to address a lot of the billing issues, the interest that paid for lending resources on the network, which is a great fix. But I think if we don't address this other issue with the CPU billing auditability of block producers, down the road this could be an issue. If you have a specific application, for example, that maybe isn't liked for some reason, it's possible that a BP or maybe you have a mining type application on the network, such as you do now with EOS, and there's nothing stopping necessarily a BP from taking portions of a transaction and or taking portions of a block, I should say, and using some of that to mine that project, right? That would be another example. So I thought I'd at least hint at this. I know this wasn't a very clean video. I'm kind of thugging it out today in the car. Got some snacks or some food for tomorrow. I use these coconut flakes for my breakfast, so I don't just eat a bunch of carbs. No sugar in them, obviously, but kind of use those for early breakfast with some protein. But totally random thought there. Sorry guys about that. But I guess what I was gonna say is I just wanted to give you guys my take on this whole thing and kind of give you guys my thoughts on the whole CPU billing issue that hasn't been discussed. I haven't seen anybody discuss it. So I'd like to see more discussions on this. I'd like to know what you guys think about it. Do you think that block.one should incorporate auditability tools? Maybe some way to have consensus, some way to align the incentives of how many transactions are in a block, okay, with the amount of pay that potentially block producers are given for their service. So I think that would potentially address this issue with the empty blocks. And I'd love to know of some ideas on how we could address the arbitrary billing and the fact that some BPs are going to bill users more CPU for like a specific action, a transaction on the network, when other BPs might do a lot less. And so it's not a uniform set of results. You think about a machine or a system, a real system in the real world. It has to be somewhat more predictable. They're very predictable in terms of control systems. You send it an input and you get an output, and irrespective of which number of end components you use, the behavior and performance and the cost should be relatively the same. And so if we're seeing significant differences in that between the elected BPs, or the producing BPs, I should say, then that's an issue. So I'd like to know what you guys think about this. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Hit the like button, and if you like this content, consider subscribing. And until next time, this is Phoenix signing off. Peace.